There are people who seem impossible to categorize. You look at their lives and the pieces don't seem like they should fit together. A child who struggled with numbers but went on to study physics and mathematics, a teenager who lost chunks of her hair and had to learn confidence before she even understood what confidence meant, a young woman who moved through countries, cultures, and classrooms, constantly rebuilding her sense of belonging, a solo traveler navigating South America without speaking the language, a consultant at Boston Consulting Group, someone who would go on to work directly with the chairman and CEO of Mahindra Holidays, helping build an entirely new business vertical from the ground up, the founder of Java Plum, and today the co founder of Tangelo Ice Cream, proving that healthy food can still bring joy. A mountaineer, an entrepreneur, a foodie who would later discover that her own body was forcing her to completely rethink its relationship with food. Most people see success and assume confidence came first. But what if confidence wasn't the starting point? What if confidence was simply the result of surviving enough moments that could have broken you? Today's conversation is about identity, about resilience, about self worth, and reinvention. About what happens when life keeps changing the rules and you keep deciding to play anyway. Ayesha Malhotra, welcome to Unapologetic Me. Thank you for trusting us with your story.
Thank you, Ekta, and thank you for having me.
Um, I always find it fascinating that we spend so much time talking about what people have achieved and so little time talking about who they were before any of it happened, before the businesses, degrees, titles, before life started asking difficult questions. So let's begin at the very beginning. When you think about yourself as a little girl, tell us, who was Aisha?
When I was a little girl, there were only two things I loved.
Hmm.
I loved climbing. I used to be climbing up the grills of our house. I used to be swinging off them. I tried to climb trees. I tried to climb little rocks. I loved climbing and I loved to read. I always had my nose in a book. Books. I just loved them. I even ranked people's homes by the books that they had in their house. So if my parents said we've got to go to someone's house, I'd think about it and say, oh well, yeah, they've got nice books. I can go there. Other places, I just pick up three or four books with me and take them along. I just loved only these two things, reading and climbing.
Love that. What kind of a child were you when nobody was watching?
There were two things I was doing, and there was a third. I was always reading. I was either trying to climb something or the other, swing off something or the other. I just had this penchant for wanting to swing, jump. And the third thing I did was daydream. And I daydreamed because I think I found the world in the books I read so much more exciting, right? My life to me was routine and boring. You went to school, I used to run, so I used to go for training. I came back. We all led very regimented lives, right, when we were kids. And the life in books was so exciting. So I would sit down and I had this rocking chair in my room. And when I had downtime, I'd just close my eyes and then imagine I was in one of those books.
So, talking about books and talking about climbing and everything, did you always have a sense of curiosity and adventure? Was it always there?
It was always there, Ekta, but sometimes I wonder whether how much of things of the person we become is innate and how much is our environment, how much our environment shapes us, right? Because
Yeah.
I always had that sense of curiosity and adventure, but my parents also encouraged it. My parents were very similar, right? So for instance, I began trekking at the age of 11, and that was because my mother wanted to trek and she had two young daughters, right? So she took us along. And
Hmm.
then she became a trek leader for our school, and she'd take all the other kids along, and she planned and she worked with this other group that used to organize the treks, and she became a trek leader with them. So my mother introduced me to all these things, and I think my parents still encourage my sense of adventure. In fact, I think even today, whenever I think of something new that I'm going to try, right, my parents are more excited than I am. They're thrilled.
Okay.
They're thrilled to see, oh, she's doing this, she's doing that. Like my dad has always wanted me to ride a motorcycle, right? He used to ride motorcycles, but I have this mortal fear of traffic. So that's the one thing I haven't done. Even now, he tells me, Aisha, I think you should learn. You'll really love it. And I think when you said I'm always very grateful to them for that. For instance, when I trekked up to Everest Base Camp, right, that came about because of my dad, right? I'd always wanted to go, but life happens as you get older, right? You've got to take
Yeah.
out enough time to go. And one day, suddenly, my dad calls me up and he says, Aisha, Aisha, can you get leave in a month's time? I said, well, I'll check. It might be possible. Let me see. I said, why? He said, because I was talking to someone on the phone and he's going to Everest Base Camp with a friend who's a mountaineer. And you know what? I asked him, can my daughter join? She would love this. And they said, okay, yeah, as long as it's your daughter, so we know who she is.
Yeah.
And that's it. And I joined them. So I always, thank my dad for that. I said, it's because of him that it came about so unexpectedly. It would have happened at some point, but yes. So I always did have that sense of adventure and curiosity, but I think my parents also encouraged it, and they still do to this day.
Love the fact that you mentioned that he gets so much more excited about each and every new adventure of yours, still nudges you for driving the bike, which I'm sure you're going to update very, very soon saying that, hey, I added that in my kitty already now. But I'm going to bring your focus to the fact that you said that you enjoyed climbing and you spent time outside. What role do you think the outdoors and the mountains played in your childhood?
The outdoors and the mountains, I think they've shaped so much of who I am, right? And the two major roles they played was one, we always went climbing or trekking during vacations, right? And then over weekends. So it was always an escape. It was always a holiday. So when I think of the mountains, when I think of climbing, I just think to me, it's relaxation, it's holiday, getting away from the busyness and the routine of life, right? That's one aspect. So I find them relaxing. The minute I go and I'm in a mountainous area, I relax. My whole mind relaxes.
Yeah.
The other thing is they challenged me. I learned so much because I went rock climbing. I began rock climbing when I was 10 years old. I began trekking when I was 11. And then the treks became annual. The rock climbing became more frequent in the year. And I've continued throughout my life. And I would say I almost grew up in the mountains, right? Every year I can tell how old I was, how strong I was, what challenges I was facing, what was happening in my life. And there's something about trekking and climbing, you're on your own, you're on your own. It's you and your body, right? You're pushing yourself, you're pushing your limits, and it's about taking one step forward. It's when you're so exhausted you can't walk anymore, or when you're climbing and you're not sure if you'll be able to hold on. If you put your finger on this hold, will it be able to take my weight? And it does, right? So you learn to trust yourself, you learn to trust your instincts. Yes, I can do this, this is the right judgment call I'm making. The other thing you learn is, I think you learn to trust other people, right? With treks and climbing, you have to trust the people that you're with. When you're rock climbing, you have to trust that the person who's belaying you is going to do it right. They will arrest the fall. Someone's going to check your knot. They're going to do it correctly, right? You have to you have to trust them. And I think learning to trust someone who you may not know very well, but trusting their skill, I think it's something you have to learn to do through life. And it's
Yeah.
only now that I'm older, right? And now that I've started Tangelo and I'm working with many people I don't know very well, right? They joined me, we're working together. And I realized that I can't do everything myself, right? So I have to delegate. You have to delegate and let go. And you have to trust that they will do their job and they will do it right. And as we were talking about it, I suddenly realized I think this is one of the most important things it's taught me, to trust myself,
Yeah.
trust my judgment, and also trust other people. Say they will manage it. You're okay.
You very nicely give an answer to the next question that I was going to ask you. But I'm still going to ask that when you look back now, all of these things that you're telling us, how the childhood was and things that really kicked your energy, what signs of the woman would you become were already visible back in the day? Did you think you had an idea you're going to be so entrepreneurial and you're going to be accomplishing so many things? Did you have an idea at that time?
I at that point I had no idea what entrepreneurship was. I
Yeah.
I actually wanted to just climb. So I was trying to think of ways that I could have a career that enabled climbing. So I thought of becoming a geologist. I think of all kinds of careers that would enable me to spend my life climbing. But then I realized that I also have a lot of intellectual that I love I have an intellectual curiosity as well. And that wouldn't just that wouldn't satisfy me. And then of course, as you grow up, right, your environment shapes you. We all have expectations. You have to grow up, right, and lead a
Yeah.
normal life and build a life for yourself. So to answer your question, I think at some point in life you go full circle. I think when you're young, you do know who you really are and what you really want to do, right? And I know the person I was. And then I think as you grow up, as I said, expectations take over, reality sets in, adulthood happens. There are various things you have to manage. And for many of us, some of us are lucky enough to not have to lead the life we always wanted to, but many other things take a backseat, right? And then I think at some point you rediscover yourself again, and
Yeah.
that's what's happened for me. And I'm really pleased about that because I finally gone back to the becoming the person I was and the person I really wanted to be and doing the things I really wanted. So I think life goes full circle.
Love
But I'm
that.
all, yeah.
And we're going to be exploring all facets of your personality, which are very inspiring. Aisha, when we were doing the research, one of the things which stood out for us in your story is that life repeatedly handed you reasons to doubt yourself, and yet every single time you seem to move in the opposite direction, which brings me to one of the earliest mountains you had to climb. When you were made aware that you learned differently, what was the reaction at that point in time?
No, Ekta, I think I never realized when I was younger that I learned differently. I never realized that I had dyscalculia, right? I never knew it. I was told this by a professor late in college who recognized it and pointed it out. And then it all began to make sense. So I
Hmm.
never realized that. I just thought I was dumb, honestly. It was as simple as
Yeah.
that because there was no awareness of
What it really
learning,
is.
yeah, of what it is. And at that time, there really was no awareness, right?
Yeah, yeah.
And math and addition and subtraction is something so basic, right? You expect people to know. And I didn't have dyslexia. I was a voracious reader.
Hmm,
I
hmm.
wrote well. I was good at everything else that I did in school, right? So it made absolutely no sense that a child could do geometry, and I was very good at geometry, and could not do basic arithmetic, right? For instance, I remember in our math exams, we used to have half the paper that was 50 points was for arithmetic and 50 points for geometry, and the total was 100. And my
Hmm.
score most of the time was 49 or 50, and the pass mark was 40 out of 100, so I passed just because I'd score 49 or 50 on the geometry part and zero on the arithmetic because I just couldn't read the numbers. I couldn't add or subtract. I couldn't read a clock. And when you get confused I couldn't use a combination lock. When you do these basic things and everyone either, your parents think you're either lazy or just not trying hard enough, right? And
Yeah.
your friends just are baffled, right? So they just say, my God, are you so stupid? Can't you read the clock? It was a joke, right? It was just a joke, but I just grew up thinking I was plain dumb. That's all.
Let me ask you this way. What was harder at that point in time? Do you think the subject itself or the story people start attaching to your abilities?
It wasn't the subject, it was just the story, right? It was very difficult because math is something that is so basic, right? And I remember my dad used to sit down on weekends and he'd try to teach me. And I remember he used to just get so frustrated because he couldn't figure it out. He'd keep saying, listen, you cannot be dumb if you can do geometry. How can you do geometry? How can you so good at history? How can you do other things? How can you not add and subtract and do basic arithmetic? And then I think we even had teachers in school. People couldn't understand that, right? So people would just think I'm lazy or
Hmm.
I'm just not trying at this one thing. It made no sense. And and I I just began to hate math. I began to hate it became a real problem. I just hated math. I hated anyone associated with maths. I
Hmm.
couldn't stand it. And I remember in sixth grade, I had this dream once that I'd murdered our maths teacher, right? Because she used to get after me. And it was really funny. And she used to get after me. And many years later, she really traumatized me. But many years later, I learned that she had a very difficult marriage and she had
Hmm.
a very abusive life at home,
Oh
right?
no.
And so I understood. Finally, I understood why she was the way she was. And
Hmm. Hmm.
I've now learned empathy, right? I've learned that people are not inherently nasty or mean. There's usually a driver, there's something driving people.
I think it's kind of nice that you've forgiven her for, and you've given a lot of thought into what led her for that kind of behavior. But I still feel as a teacher, you have a sense of responsibility of encouraging a child and developing the love for the subject, whether they choose to pursue it later or not.
It is.
But I'm very curious to learn, when you're a child, it's not really your own opinion, but your perspective of the world is shaped by the people around and what you're feeling and what you're sensing. Was there at any point of time that you underestimated your own self?
I think when it, no, I didn't underestimate myself. I think I just felt a lot of pressure to be good at math. It's as simple as that, right?
Yeah.
Because I was good at everything else. And when you're not good at one thing and the whole world wants you to be good at that one thing, or you're told that one thing is the most important thing to be good at, right? I think we, or at least I grew up at a time when maths was deemed very important, right? People couldn't fathom a career if you studied history, right? I remember asking my parents, why can't I study history? I'm so good at it. I love history. And they said, and what are you going to do if you study history, right?
Yeah.
What kind of career are you going to have? My parents' friends would say the same. They said, well, I studied English literature. Look where I got. You need to study maths, or you need to study engineering or medicine. Medicine was out of the question because the sight of blood frightens me, and so does injections. So that was out of the question. But I think it's, I didn't underestimate myself. I just felt a lot of pressure to be good at maths. It's simple as that.
Now, listening to the entire story, I think most people would have run away from mathematics for obvious reasons. You eventually earned a degree in physics and mathematics. First question, why? And second question, was that decision driven by curiosity, defiance, or something else altogether?
That decision was driven, Ekta, just by the fact that I had decided I was going to be good at this thing. That's it. I hated it. I hated math, but I just decided I wanted to be good at it, because if it was so important to everyone and I couldn't understand why I couldn't do this one thing, right? Why I couldn't do this one thing. And to me, that was the biggest mountain I had to climb in my life, right? And I remember in when I was in eighth grade, my parents finally got me a tutor. And this tutor, Mr. Sharma, I'm forever grateful to him. He is one of the kindest individuals ever. And he's the first person, I think, who didn't call me stupid, right? Who didn't lose his temper, who didn't raise his voice, who didn't get frustrated. He was just the kindest person. He had this serene expression on his face. And when I'd ask the same question 10 times and I'd make the same basic stupid error 20 times, the expression on his face didn't change. All he did was he sat with me and he realized what I was doing wrong. And he realized that I was mixing up all the numbers. So to teach me to multiply and add, subtract, divide, he started drawing patterns, right? He realized if I'm good at geometry, I can memorize patterns. So he'd say, okay, this is what you do. You see, the first number you put here, the second one, whatever it is, copy it and write it here. And then this will lead to this. And he made me practice those patterns over and over and over again till I memorized them. And finally, at the end of the year, I actually managed to get 34 out of 50 in mathematics, which was a turning point, right? And after that, I just decided I had to be good at this. And that is why I studied physics and maths in college. To be honest, though, when I did get to college mathematics is not so much about arithmetic anymore, right? It becomes more theoretical. So, which is why I began to become good at it, because the numbers were gone out of that. And I
Yeah.
picked and chose my classes. I also realized in college, you have a lot of choice. So you can choose the classes that you're good at. So I studied real analysis. I studied other things. I left out subjects where I could see
Yeah.
which I find more challenging. But to me, I actually, by the end, that was one of the proudest things in my life that I was able
What
to study physics and maths, and I got the physics prize in college, which was something I'm inordinately proud of. So,
what did that change in you when you say you feel proud of yourself?
you know, it gave me confidence. It gave me confidence that something that I found so difficult, that I'd struggled with all my life, I was actually good at it and I could conquer it. And that lesson has stayed with me for the rest of my life. I don't deal with physics or math anymore, right? But my fear of things that are deemed challenging, difficult, the unknown, complex, that disappeared forever. What I learned was that if I create a strategy to learn something, I'll be able to solve it. And if I stick with it, I'll be able to soon master it. And I think that confidence has stuck with me. So whatever I do in life now that's new, I now know that, okay, it's complex and difficult now, but I just have to break it down into steps and practice and learn my way. Earlier you'd said about learning differently. At that point, I realized I learn and study differently. College gave me a lot of flexibility, right?
Love
Because the way exams are structured, tests are structured, so we could each
that.
study in our own way. Once I was out of the regimentation that schools have, I
Yeah.
began to flourish because I could now study and learn my way.
Now, Aisha, you have a story where you went through the whole process. You saw the traumatic part. Somebody came into the picture, explained, made it easier for you, and then you came out of the whole scare. But so, if I have to ask you that, what do people still misunderstand about learning disabilities today? What will you say?
I think what people misunderstand is that a learning disability in one area of your life doesn't mean you're not good at all the others, right? It just
Yeah.
means there's one part of your brain that functions differently. That's all it is. And I think people are quick to some it has changed a lot, Ekta, but I think to some extent people assume that it translates into many
Hmm.
other
Hmm.
aspects, right? And it doesn't, right?
It,
Maybe all you need is just a little bit of support there, and that means you can do many other things. For instance, my first job out of college was I was a software engineer, right?
hmm.
I never in my life thought I'd be a software engineer. When I was a kid, I couldn't figure out how to use a calculator until I memorized what each of the symbols meant. And then I was able to navigate that. I literally had to memorize it. But I became a software engineer. And one of my mentors there, and my manager, the person who hired me, I, I still remember I used to still misread the numbers. And when you submitted your code and it was compiled twice a day, and that's the entire company's code is being compiled, the entire division's code, right? And if you type the wrong file name, it'll all crash. So they've got to figure out who's typed the wrong file name and then recompile it. And
Yeah.
initially, a few times, it was me quite often because I'd mistype, I'd look at it and I'd read it and I'd say 1 2, and that is 1 2, that is 1 2, and then I'd write 2 1, or I'd write 2 2. I just misread the whole thing. And my mentor and my manager there realized this, and they realized that I was very good at my work, but for some reason I was just misreading numbers all the time. So all he did was he'd say, listen, before you submit a file, just call me and I'll just check that you have read the name correctly and you've named it and numbered it correctly, right? That was the kindest thing ever. And that's sort of coming back to what you asked. I think people just need a little bit of support. I didn't need anyone to do my work for me. I was very good at that. I just needed someone to just check the file names and read it. And
Yeah.
someone was kind enough to do that. And if
Yeah.
a lot other people with learning disabilities had the same level of support or empathy even in the workplace, and workplaces are not places where people are generally empathetic. There's a lot of
Yeah.
competition, right? But I was lucky enough to meet really good people and
Shout
work
out
with,
to him who
yes,
stepped in at the right time and told you that overall the picture wasn't that bad. It was just a check that was required.
yeah,
And you were given enough credit for your hard work,
yeah.
which usually goes unnoticed in situations like these. But Aisha, let me bring you back to the school days. And since you've conquered and seen the entire situation, let me ask you, if you could redesign education based on your own experience, what would you for sure change in the system?
Ekta, I'll begin first by saying that I think designing academic programs requires a lot of experience, which I don't have. So I don't want to say something
Sure.
that may not be entirely true. But I would think that kids should have more avenues to explore different careers and different paths and different things that they're good at. And I think every skill that someone is good at should be celebrated.
Yeah.
When I was a kid, there were certain subjects that were deemed star subjects, right? Maths, physics, chemistry. You're studying engineering, you're in the pre-med stream, right? That's deemed tougher. Those are star streams. There was arts that was considered not as important, right? And I think that I wish that would change. I'm not sure. I'm really not aware what the school system is like right now, but I hope that has changed, right? That every subject is given equal importance. And especially today, I think that's even more important today because today there are so many more career opportunities, right?
Hmm.
So it's not that if you study history, you're not going to be able to make much of a career. You can do that even today because the world has changed so much. So I
Yeah.
hope subjects are given equal importance and every skill and every subject is celebrated equally.
Love that. Now, Aisha, the interesting thing about confidence is that people often assume it comes from achievement. But some of our deepest battles happen long before we accomplish anything. And for many women, those battles begin with the mirror. You were 14 when you began losing your hair. Can you take us back to that period?
That was, I'd had malaria followed by jaundice. And I'd been out of school for a few months. And then one day, and I had waist length hair at the time, one day I noticed that I woke up in the morning and I saw there's no hair on one side of my head. And a few days later, there was no hair on the other. And there was just hair on the floor behind me. And it was diagnosed as alopecia, and I was losing my hair. And I was mortified. I was completely mortified, right? I didn't want to cut my hair because that would mean the baldness would be more visible. So I kept my hair long so I could tie whatever hair was left over it over the bald patches. I was absolutely mortified. I was terrified. My dermatologist kept saying that, it will come back. It will come back, right? Alopecia is not permanent. But as a child, you can't believe that. And my biggest fear was going back to school. I was absolutely terrified. I mean, there were a few friends who'd been visiting me at home during that time who'd seen me losing my hair, but I was terrified of walking into school. I was terrified of walking out of the house. I'd already lost so much weight that I looked like a skeleton, and then you have no hair and answering people's questions and facing their stares. But an amazing thing happened when I went back to school. Everyone pretended as if there was nothing wrong with my hair. People just acted like I was completely normal, that they couldn't see the bald patches. And I'm forever grateful to that. And I've come to believe that, kids have an amazing ability to be empathetic. They
Yeah.
really do. I think sometimes we underestimate their ability to understand and be kind. And people weren't overly sympathetic. They weren't asking questions. They weren't staring. They just acted like there was nothing different. And I think that's what you need, right? When there's something about you that you're self-conscious about, if people don't notice it, it makes it normal, right? And that's what they did. And I remember when my hair eventually started growing back, the new hair that came out was white, right? So that was the second shock. I said, oh, good God, now what? Am I going to look like a zebra?
Yeah.
And that was just because the pigmentation takes longer to return. It turned black later, right?
Hmm.
And I remember at that time there was this ad on TV for Godrej hair dye, right? And they had a very young model with long straight black hair, and I also had long straight black hair, and she
Hmm.
had one patch of white hair in the middle, which just looked so unnatural, because young people don't go gray, and if you do go gray, you don't start graying in patches. It looked unnatural. I mean, she looked like me, right? I said, oh, good God, this is what I look like. This is all I need. And I went to school. And again, no one mentioned the ad. And one day, the sports teacher turned around and said, hey, Aisha, why don't you use Godrej hair dye? Don't you see it on TV? And
Hmm.
now it's funny, but at that point, I just flushed and I was so embarrassed. And I'll never forget, my friends just turned and glared at him. And one of them, who was very outspoken, actually just told him off. I mean, these were 14, 15-year-old kids who actually told him off. So, so yeah, I'm forever grateful to my friends and the kids in school. And you were asking about confidence, right? I didn't
Yes.
have confidence. I was not confident about my hair. I mean, when I was losing my hair. And then by the end of the year, an amazing thing happened. That year, I got the most number of Valentine's Day cards, which I thought was the sweetest thing. They were sympathy cards, but I still think it's completely sweet that people would go out of their way to be so kind that they'd go to Archie's. Those were the days you'd go to Archie's, buy a card, write a note
Yeah.
in it. I thought it was really sweet. And I think my confidence returned from the fact that people treated me like I was normal. And I
Yeah.
think that's what you need, right? When you feel there's an imperfection in you, when something's wrong with you, when the world doesn't notice it, you go on because no one's paying attention to it. You know it more than what anyone else does.
Actually, let me ask you, standing today, what would you tell that 14-year-old girl?
I would say it gets better. Don't worry. It all passes. That's what I learned during that time. That time was a really challenging time because not only did I lose my hair, not only did my hair turn white, then we moved. That was the time we moved three countries, right? So I did 10th, 11th, 12th grade in three countries, and then college in a fourth country. So that was challenging enough as it is. I
Yeah.
changed three different school systems as well. I ended up taking my A levels through the British Council because the school I was in that was for 12th grade was so small. My class had just seven people. So my parents said, well, take your SATs, apply to college in the US, and even though the A levels are 2 years and the school wouldn't let me sit the exams in 1 year, I said just study through the British Council because I needed a school leaving certificate. And that was also the time I did my basic mountaineering course in HMI in Manali at that time. So I was 15 then. So after my board exams, I went for that. After I finished that, we moved to Dubai. So that time was just completely, it was incredibly challenging. But what I learned during that time is everything passes. Eventually, it all passes. And second, keep going. Just stay focused on what you want to do, right? I had to stop thinking about my hair. I had to stop thinking about the bald patches. I had to stop thinking about, you know, okay, next year we are moving again to another country. What's going to happen? Just stay focused on what you have to do. I had only two things to do then. I had to study, I had to get to college, and I wanted to pursue mountaineering, and I wanted to run. So stick to that. That's it. They were my saviors, actually. I think sport at
Yeah.
that time became my savior.
Talking about moving to different countries, I mean, this was actually my transition, which you covered very nicely. Different countries and education systems. How did those constant transitions shape you?
I think, Ekta, there are positives and negatives, right?
Hmm.
I think that's with any experience in life, right? Anything that happens in life, there's a positive and a negative.
Yeah.
The positives were that I learned to get along with many different people, right? I became completely adaptable when
Hmm.
it came to people, the environment, country, culture, whatever. You could throw me anywhere, and I just settled down very quickly. I learned the lay of the land. I figured out how to get along with people. And the schools I went to also had people of all nationalities, right? There were people from Lebanon, Palestine, India, Egypt, Pakistan, Syria, Ethiopia, Germany, Austria, the UK, France. There were people from all over, right? It was all mixed up. And these were cultures I was not aware of, right?
Hmm.
I had never met anyone from Iraq, Palestine. I couldn't understand their challenges. It was very different. And what I learned then is how to get along with different people.
Yeah.
And what happened, when you have put kids from so many different countries together, right? And there were just one or two of us from each nationality. You have to get along as on a human level. That's what I learned, right? That at the end of the day, all human beings, it doesn't matter what country they're from, what religion they are, what social background they're from, right? Everyone has the same problems, same hopes, same dreams, same desire. You can talk to any family. It doesn't matter whether you're talking to a family that's extraordinarily wealthy and a family that's a regular middle class family. You could
Yeah.
be talking to a family that even someone who's a fruit seller on the street, a fruit vendor, he's still got a family, right? That person will have the same hopes, same dreams, same problems, same issues with their kids, with their families, with their in laws,
Yeah.
their same hope. And you've got to connect on that level. And that's what I've learned, to just drop everything else and connect with people on that level. I learned that. And go ahead.
No, I was just going to say that when we're exposed to different situations, it kind of gives us a chance to be a new person. And like you learned a lot about adaptability, learning about different cultures, did you ever struggle with belonging at that point in time?
Yes, Ekta. That is something I struggled with. For a long time, I struggled during that time, and I struggled for a long time afterwards because
Yeah.
I honestly didn't know where I belonged anymore. Right? I didn't know when someone asked me where home was, I didn't know how to answer that question. Right? My parents lived in Oman. I was from India. I didn't feel Indian at that point because I'd spent so many years living abroad. I didn't know who I was. I really didn't know what culture I belonged to. I didn't know where I would settle down, and I felt rootless until someone in college, someone I didn't know him very well, but one day we were chatting and he said something, and he was from Eastern Europe, and so we were talking about home and belonging, and he said, what I've learned now is home is in my heart. I carry it in my heart, and home is wherever I am now. He said, what I've learned, that I have to focus on the here and now and where I am at the moment, and I carry all those other parts of my life with me, but
Yeah.
home is where I am at present. And that made so much sense to me, right? That is something I've carried throughout my life. And now when I look back at all the moving around that I did in all my, in my teens and my 20s, I'm very grateful for that because feel it's made me a richer person. And even now, when today people ask me, where are you from? Right?
Yeah.
I I still find that question difficult to answer because I can't see myself as one person. I'm an amalgamation of all these things. And wherever I am today, that's home. But I'm an amalgamation and I carry all those places and all those people with me.
Love that. Love that term amalgamation. All right, let me ask you this way: that being exposed to different situations, meeting different people, challenging environments, adaptability. Do you think those years were gradually preparing you for entrepreneurship later in life?
Well, I wouldn't say directly, but I think the biggest skill I learned then was adaptability. And sometimes when I'm overwhelmed or I face a difficult situation now, I often find myself looking back at those years.
Yeah.
And the reason is that because I went through so much in those years, right? And so much was transient, and there was very little that was in my control at that time, right?
Hmm.
And what I learned, and there are two things I learned from that time. And I look back and I say, wait, when I went through that, how did I manage? How did I succeed? And I go back to that playbook. And my playbook was very simple, that accept change, right? I had to accept that nothing is permanent and I
Yeah.
can't control whether it will be permanent or not. And whatever happens, I have to accept it. And that's what I've learned now. It really helps me because I've learned that when you're starting a business, I don't know what is permanent. Circumstances may change. We have stores in malls. A mall may close. Something else may change. And staff may leave. The whole environment around you may change. Regulations may, there are many things that may change, right? You've just got to learn to be adaptable and roll with it, right? I learned that. And the second thing it taught me, learn to work with different types of people, right? At that time. At that point, when I was shifting different countries, even when I went for the mountaineering course, that was the first time I'd met people from all parts of India, right? I had never met people from so many parts of India. I grew up in Delhi and Bombay, right? So you learn to get along and work with different types of people. And you learn to connect with them again, as I said, on a human level. And that's what I find even at Tangelo. I work with all kinds of people, right? I work with mall management, retailers, chefs. They're all kinds of people I work with. And you have to eventually start connecting with people on a human level.
Yes.
And I always look back at that time and say, well, what was my playbook then? How did I deal with all that then? And how did I get through it? And I look back and say, yeah, this is what I did. And okay, sit back. And the third lesson is that it all passes and gets better. As you said, what would I tell my younger self? I tell myself the same thing now. I said, when there's a challenge is thrown at me and it just seems too large, I say, you know what? Okay, step by step, we'll get through it. And
Yeah.
this too shall pass and things will get better.
This is such a good line. I think it's important. I mean, I feel like we become wiser with age through experiences and situations. But the kind of clarity that we develop over a period of time, I wish we had it back then. So things would have been a lot more easier when we were in that situation. But then everything has to happen, and you have to follow that circle of learning, which is also very right. But Aisha, listening to your story, I feel there's a pattern emerging. Every time life placed you in an unfamiliar territory, your response wasn't retreat, it was curiosity. And perhaps nowhere is that more obvious than what comes next. One of my favorite stories about you is that you knew no programming and still managed to turn a 3 month internship into a software engineering job. Take us through that. How did that happen?
Ekta, that's another thing I'm very proud of. And I've learned that sometimes doors open in the most unexpected places. You've just got to be open. You don't know, right? I graduated in 2001, and that was when it was the dot-com crash, right? There were very few jobs in the US. Job offers were being rescinded. They were being put off for another year or so. It was a difficult time. And I didn't know any programming. I did not wish to work with computers, right? I liked theoretical mathematics, theoretical physics. That was where my strengths lay. Computers were not my strength, right?
Hmm.
And I just stayed away from them. And then, but jobs were difficult at that point, right? Job offers were being rescinded. And I said, now what's going to happen, right? I can't wait 10 months to start a job, right? I don't know what's about to happen. And at that point, someone from the company I ended up working at, my manager called me and got my CV through a professor. And he got my CV and he called me up and he said, listen, I've got your CV and, you've studied physics. And I was a physicist at CERN and we write software that's used by chip designers, right? Chip design companies. So I think, a person with a physics background will be very useful on our team. Everyone else we've got are all from computer science background. So I think you'll be a good addition. However, no programming, no background in computer science. So I can't justify hiring you. So what I can offer you is a 3-month internship. And if you can pick up programming, the job is yours. Are
Yeah.
you ready to take that? Ekta, when you have no other choices, you have no option to say, but yes. So I said yes. And then I walked down to the bookstore the college bookstore and I bought a book on basic programming, right? It was literally the level of dummies. And I started studying. And I think it was the last term of college. And while everyone was partying, I did do a bit of that as well. I sat down in the computer lab and started studying. And I only had one thought in my mind, right? I said, all the years that I felt programming was extraordinarily difficult, this is not for me. When push comes to shove and you have to do things, I think human beings are capable of incredible things, right? I taught myself programming and it was 6 weeks later, I was offered a full time job. And that is what was so astounding. They'd said 3 months, and 6 weeks later came this job. And it changed my life, right? And I was really good at it. And one of the things I'm so proud of that because I always thought computer science was something I could not do. And I was actually good at it. And I began to enjoy it. And I actually began to see a different side of life, right? A
Wow.
subject I'd never understood. And, as I was coming back to how this all happened, I think one of the things is they're saying you have to you have to be open to opportunity. Don't say no, right? Even if something feels difficult, it would have been easy for me to say, oh God, no, not computer science. This is going to be a nightmare. But I had no other options, which brings me back to another thing is, when you, as I remember in my third year of college, I was supposed to start an internship, right? And when I was starting this internship, my visa for the internship didn't come through on time. And I think that happens to many students, right? And I couldn't start it. So I was sitting there at a crossroads, not knowing what to do. And one of my physics professors said, well, Aisha, okay, do you want to work with me, right? Why don't you work with me? I've got this project. I want to work on something. And I said, okay, sure. Because I had nothing to do but to wait for the visa. And I
Yeah.
worked and I looked at it at that point. I said, what if this visa doesn't come through and then my internship won't come through? And I said to myself, well, I've got to make something out of this project then, right? This can't just be something I'm just using to pass the time. So I gave it my all. I just started working at it. I had no idea where it would lead to. I said, okay, I guess I can continue this into a special studies for my senior year. I'll convert it into something, if I give it something, right? Ekta, the most amazing thing happened. 6 months later, we did convert it into a special studies. Another professor joined the project. We did enough work for me to be able to present the work at 2 conferences.
Okay.
Then, after I graduated, so I worked on it for a year and a half. After I graduated, other students subsequently joined the same project. The project kept growing. And 3 years later, while I was working in California, my professor sends me an email and she says, Aisha, our work is being published in the American Journal of Physics. And I was astounded, right? I had forgotten all about it. I had graduated. And there I was. And I said, oh my goodness,
Yeah.
my work is actually being published all because of this one little mishap that happened when my visa didn't come and I
Yeah.
needed something to do for a month or two while I was waiting for the visa. And look at what happened. I
Yeah.
ended up working in it for 1.5 years, and so did other students later. And you behold, there it is. So you've got to be open to unexpected opportunities. Just give everything your all. When you find yourself in trouble, give it your 100%. You don't know where it's going to lead to, but when you give it 100%, something amazing may come out of it.
Yeah, and I think you very beautifully answered the question that I wanted to ask, which is what is your philosophy on learning? Which I think we can all benefit from that. Give it your all, whatever you have in front of you, and you never know how that transcends. But tell me, how do you approach something that initially feels impossible? Because I think for many people, it's the start which is troublesome. To fathom that I have no idea how I'm going to learn or where do I start. So, how can one push that battle off the head?
I think the first thing you've got to do is tell yourself nothing is too hard. It's as simple as that. If you start off believing something is too hard, you will never be able to learn it, right? And that's what I learned my years of getting over mathematics, right? That's what gave me the confidence to say I can learn programming and be good at it, because I knew I had learned and conquered mathematics, right? You've got to remove that from your mind. Nothing is too hard. Everything can be learnt. Whether it's a sport, whether it's a language, whether it's a skill, it can be learnt. It just takes time. It may take some people more time than others, but it takes time and it takes practice. And you've got to break it down into its constituent parts, right? You can't look at the whole picture and you can't learn the whole picture immediately, right? Just got to break it down into small digestible parts. Okay, so I can do this. Let me learn this. Let me learn this skill. Okay, good. That gives you a little more confidence. Then you learn skill number two. So that's the first thing. Nothing is too hard, and just
Yeah.
break it down into small skills.
Now, learning from all of this that you've said, what do you think what separates people who grow versus people who stay stuck? If there's anybody who's going to be listening to us, probably in those years,
I
what would you
think
advise?
I think the first thing is you've got to first don't say anything is too hard, too difficult, or unattainable, right? When I was graduating from college in 2001, didn't think I was going to be working as a software engineer in San Jose in California. I did not, right? No, I wouldn't even have imagined it. That was not even the job I was aiming for. I didn't know what was going to happen. I didn't think my work was going to be published in the American Journal of Physics. I didn't think any of this was going to happen. So nothing is too hard or unattainable. Everything can be achieved if you go about it in the right way. And sometimes you're not able to plan everything out, right? Like these two things didn't happen in my life because I planned them. But when something unexpected happens, if you give it your 100% and
Yeah.
you say, you know what, I'm going to I'm going to make this work, right? This I'm going to give 100%. Whatever you do, that's what I've learned. Whatever you're doing, don't dismiss it just because you think it's too small or insignificant, right? Because this small, insignificant thing or this thing that seems small and insignificant today may end up becoming very large tomorrow. So give
Yeah.
your all, break it down into steps, and you'll slowly get there. Take the first step, then the second, then the third, and doors will begin opening.
Love that. Now, there are moments in life where learning isn't just the lesson, trusting yourself is. For you, one of those moments arrived thousands of miles away from home while we were doing the research. What inspired you to backpack through South America alone, especially at a time before smartphones made everything easy?
Yeah, that was a very that was a unique time because there were no smartphones. I think there was just email. Gmail had just about begun, where you still had to get an invitation to get a Gmail account. So it was a long time ago. I remember getting one of the guides, the rough guide, and that was my Bible. I still have it today, right? I'd underline things, circle things in it. But what inspired me, Ekta, was, we talked about belonging earlier, right? And
Mm-hmm.
by that time, I had moved so many countries. I'd spent many years in the United States. I didn't feel American. I didn't feel Indian. I didn't know who I was. I didn't know where I wanted to live. I couldn't connect with one place and say, this is home. This is who I am. And I couldn't understand, right? And I had friends and family all over the world now. And I found it increasingly difficult to keep in touch with so many different people and be able to be part of so many different people's lives. And obviously, people in different parts of the world can't understand what you're going through in your
Yeah.
life, right? I was beginning to feel increasingly disconnected, and I kept asking my question, where do I want to live? Where am I going to live? Where do I belong? And in order to answer that question, I I decided to take some time off and go to South America. And South America, because it was the farthest place from anything I had ever known in my life, right?
Wow. Okay.
Europe still seemed familiar, right? Because I'd been to Europe. South America, I didn't know anything about South America. I didn't speak the language. And I just needed to understand who I was. Who was Aisha? What did I want? I couldn't understand myself. And then I decided, and I'd always had I loved Spanish. I loved listening to Spanish. I'd always wanted to learn Spanish. And I decided that's it. I'm going to go there because if I go to some place that's so different from everything I've ever known, maybe that's where I'll be able to figure out who I am and what I am. So that was what compelled me. And South America changed my life in so many ways.
Tell us, what did traveling alone, all by yourself, teach you about yourself? This was your query, which is what you wanted to find. So then, what were the things you realized?
you know, again, one of the things I realized is even when you're traveling alone, you're never alone.
Hmm.
I mean, I assumed I'd be alone, right? And I'd get to place and be by myself. I was never by myself. I met wonderful people in every place that I went to, right? I remember arriving at Manaus in Brazil, right? And I remember being on the flight. Now, but Brazil was the last country I went to, and by that time, I had picked up enough Spanish to be comfortable, right? I could speak, I could get by, etc. It was like, when people speak broken English or broken Hindi, you can still understand them. I spoke broken Spanish. Everyone could communicate with me. I could communicate with them. I got on the flight and I had gone from Bogota to Manaus, right? So I was in
Yeah.
Colombia. And this was surreal. I got on the flight at Bogota and it arrived in Manaus. And on the flight, it was a Brazilian Airlines flight. And the steward spoke Portuguese, which is completely different from Spanish. And I just stared at him and I said, oh God, this is going to be interesting. And my flight, and there was only one flight a day then, and it arrived at 2 a.m. in the morning, right?
Yeah.
So obviously, I'm not going to step out in Manaus airport at 2 a.m. So I said, okay, I'll have to sit in the airport till the sun comes up, and then I'll navigate my way through. And I was terrified. I said, oh, good God, Spanish conquered Portuguese is a whole new ball game.
Yeah.
And I arrived at Manaus airport and I sat down and suddenly this bespectacled young man was sitting there and he came a couple seats away and he came to chat with me. And I said, oh God, I hope this man isn't going to bother me or something. And he wasn't. He was just really sweet. And he was in the same boat. He was from Brazil and he'd come to visit the Amazon. And obviously he wasn't going to step out of the airport at 2 or 3 a.m. He was going to wait there too. So he sat down there and he could speak English and he chatted with me. And he said, okay, don't be scared. I'm decent. I'm not going to trouble you. Right?
Hmm.
I just saw you're alone and you can't speak Portuguese. So he chatted, we talked, he explained things, etc. And then I said goodbye in the morning and I went my way and he went his way.
Hmm.
And later, when I went to there was this canoeing trip I was taking down the Amazon. When I was walking down there and I was signing up for it and figuring it out, this German girl walked up to me and she was traveling with her school friend and she was several years younger than me and she was now getting sick of him. So she came up to me and she said, okay, you're on this too. And we started chatting and we became friends. And then we explored the whole of the Amazon together. And even after that time, we used to keep in touch over email. So I was never alone. Right? What I realized is you may think you're alone, you're never alone. You're always going to meet people somewhere, different people for short periods of time, but you're never really alone.
Love that. Um, was there a moment during that journey when you realized you were far more capable than you had imagined?
Yes, yes, Ekta. Because navigating those 6 months by myself was not easy, right? I would get exhausted sometimes. I mean, I talked about Brazil and I talked about this incident that makes it all sound easy and happy, right? Where you're meeting people. It's not always like that. You're tired. You don't know whether you're going to meet decent people. You don't know how you're going to do things. Where every new city you get to, okay, now how do I get here? Where do I stay? What do I do next? Read the guidebook. But I realized I'm capable because I got through every one of them. Each city I arrived, I was okay, this is new. Now, how do I get through this? Now, what do I do next? And I'd figure it out. And I'd figure it out in each place. Like Colombia was one of the most challenging things. Colombia was not an easy place to travel to. Colombia is not a place you'd meet other backpackers and other people. But everywhere I met local Colombians who were decent, right? And I had this fear in my mind, oh God, someone might be a drug lord or something, and I'm going to get into trouble, or someone's going to slip something into my bags. But all I met were really decent people. And I learned to be street smart. There's this one incident which is so funny. I remember I had to book a ticket to Cartagena. And when I walked into the travel agency to book it there, I had to withdraw some cash. So I
Hmm.
went out to withdraw cash. And then the woman who's the travel agent said, okay, now listen, this is what you have to do. You need to withdraw cash, but when you withdraw it and come back here. Then you go into the bathroom that's in here, that's within our travel agency. Go in there. And she says, just keep a little bit of cash in your bag with you in your pockets, right? Take the rest. And she taught me this. And she said, this is what you have to do in Colombia. You put the cash in your socks, right?
Okay.
And then tie up your sneakers and put the rest there. She said, you know how there's that common thing they tell women to put the cash in there
Yeah.
and all. She said, no, no, people know that's where there is, right? She says, because now someone has seen you walk in here, they know that you have cash. So if anyone mugs you, this is what you do. And she
Okay.
taught me all these skills. This is something that I felt like, am I in a movie? What's going on? But it was true. I mean, so you learn you're far more capable. You get through all these things and there were many moments when I'd say, okay, what next? How am I going to get through this? You get through it.
Yeah. Let me ask you, obviously, so many learnings of navigating things, meeting people, having experiences. How did that experience of South America shape the decisions you made later in life?
It removed the fear of the unknown, Ekta, right?
Hmm.
But South America, I'd faced several challenges before, but South America was completely unknown, right? In every way, everything about it was unknown. And I didn't have any friends or family there to fall back on. In other places, you do have someone who knows someone. None of that was there. It completely removed the fear of the unknown. Like
Yeah.
when I began Tangelo, it was unknown, right? Ice cream was an industry I wasn't familiar with. There were so many things that were unknown to me, right? And South America removed that fear because I kept going back that time and saying, okay, you know what then? I met the right people. If I didn't know how to do something,
Yeah.
someone taught me how to do it, right? I figured it out by trial and error. I got through it. I think that's what it did for me. It just removed the fear of the unknown.
Now, Aisha, sometimes life challenges our confidence and sometimes it challenges our plans, but sometimes it challenges our bodies. The next mountain you face wasn't visible from the outside, but it would end up changing everything. What was it like finally receiving answers around your autoimmune conditions? Did you feel relief, frustration, or maybe both?
It was relief, Ekta. Frustration I've realized is it's a worthless emotion, right? It's a wasteful emotion, right? Because frustration means you're getting angry at something that has already happened and you can't change what has happened, right?
Yeah,
So to me, that's something I've learned. I used to get very frustrated. I used to also get angry at things that had happened. I've learned you've got to let go of what's happened, look forward. For me, it was pure relief. When I was diagnosed finally with hypothyroidism, it was pure relief. And my diagnosis came about in a roundabout way. I went to the doctor for something else. There was something else wrong with my body, right? And it's too personal to talk about. And that's why I went to the doctor. And while investigating all that, they discovered I had hypothyroidism. Because my thyroid gland is now it was now so overactive, right? Or
yeah,
underactive, right? That it was now leading to something else, which led to something else, which led to things. So it was like a puzzle. I think I spent 3 days just going from tests, one test to another test to another test, because each one was leading to one more diagnosis. And it turned out that all these things that were wrong with me, everything came down to one thing. Once the hypothyroidism was diagnosed, and I was actually very relieved, Ekta, because I had suffered for years. I used to shiver. I used to shiver, and I used to go to doctors in the US and the UK, and I'd keep going and saying, I'm cold, I'm shivering. It's reached the stage now when I'm in office, I'm wearing thick shirts and I'm wearing a sweater in the summer, right? Because I'm cold in the air conditioning. And they just say, no, 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 you're borderline anemic, you're skinny, right? Because I was always skinny. Because I was skinny, because I was genetically skinny. And I was also an athlete since I was 10 years old, right? I'd been running since the age of 10. So my metabolism was really high. I was skinny. And because I was skinny, you're borderline anemic, etc. I said, listen, this makes no sense. I then began I remember I was starting to get exhausted. This was in a couple years before I was eventually diagnosed. I used to be so tired that I remember standing in line with friends at the cinema, and I actually just sat down on the pavement, right? And my friends were horrified. They said, "What are you doing?" I said, "I can't stand." And I was shocked because I was an athlete, someone who's been running since the age of 10, and I was too tired.
mountaineering, yes.
Yes, and I was too tired to stand in line in the cinema. When I'd sit on a chair, I'd put my feet up. And I said, what is wrong with me? Right? I'm 30 years old and I'm putting my feet up on a chair. And then I started gaining weight. And no one would believe me when they said I'd gain weight. And I kept telling the doctor, I'm gaining weight. It's not anemia. You keep thinking I'm borderline anemic. I'm gaining weight. But you're talking to someone who's I was skinny, right? I think I'm 5'8" and I had a BMI then of 17, right? So when a person who's that skinny says they're gaining weight, doctors think you're delusional, right? Or you have
Hmm.
an eating disorder or a problem. And I'm saying, no, I am gaining weight because I can see it on
Yeah.
my body. And I was gaining weight because of the hypothyroidism. So for me, it was complete relief. And then many years later, I was diagnosed with severe gluten intolerance, right? And that also came about because I was diagnosed a couple years later with another serious autoimmune disease. It's again too personal to talk about what it exactly is.
Sure.
But
Yeah.
when I was diagnosed with that is when my dermatologist said, and she was dealing with that. She said, for, when people have 3 or 4 autoimmune conditions, they generally have severe gluten intolerance. She said it all runs together. Everything starts from what you eat and from the gut. And she said you've had alopecia, you've got you're hypothyroid. Now there's this, right? She says it's multiple autoimmune conditions. And she made me give up gluten, right? And Ekta, my life changed after that. It's
Yeah.
like my skin cleared up, the bloating vanished, the heartburn vanished, several problems vanished. Gluten, and now if I eat too much gluten, if I eat it, sometimes it happens, right? Because you don't know whether there's gluten in something or someone hands you something. Or I remember once I was trekking and there was absolutely no choice because there was no food to eat, right? Other than bread or something, right? And I didn't know what to do, and I'd run out of the packets of oats I'd carried. So I just ate the sandwiches. By the night, I woke up with such a stomach ache, such a severe stomach ache. My body can't react to it. But for me, it was always relief, Ekta. It was coming back to the original question. It was always relief.
Now, how do these health challenges challenge or change your relationship with your own self? You accepted what you do not or you cannot eat, but was it initially like a struggle, or how did it work out for you?
Ekta, when you have to give up certain food groups, it's not easy, right?
Yeah.
It's really not easy. And gluten is one of the hardest because it's in everything, right? When you go to a restaurant, 90% of the menu is eliminated, right? And gluten is also harder to mimic when you try to bake or do anything. I've been baking since I was 12 years old, right? But when you try to do gluten-free baking, it is not easy. It doesn't taste the same.
Yeah.
It's not so, but and the other thing that happens is I think sometimes I used to have this fear of sounding antisocial, right? Like I'd go out with friends and have to say, no, I can't eat this and I can't eat this. Let's avoid the Italian place because I'm going to eat nothing there but the burrata, right? There's nothing
Yeah.
else,
Yeah.
right? So you have this slight fear of that. But eventually you get over it because you have to. And you have to accept it, right? You have to accept it and you have to start enjoying other types of food. So it changed the way I cooked at home. It changed the way what I ate. We started exploring different types of food, different cuisines. Our habits changed at home. So I think it's also made me a richer person because I've learned about so many new cuisines, so many different types of foods that I perhaps may not have tried if I'd still been able to eat gluten.
Love that. I think it was completely a change in perspective, which is how you brought different food items and then experimented. But this is where your story takes a fascinating turn because many people experience a personal challenge. Few people build a company around solving it. I have a feeling Tangelo isn't just something about ice cream. Tell me if I'm wrong.
No,
What's
it
your
isn't.
point?
I think ice cream was just one manifestation of it,
Hmm.
right? It was just one manifestation. What really drove me to Tangelo was about making food that with ingredients that are good for you because that's what it became, or good for your body, or that don't harm your body.
Hmm.
That is what led me to it eventually. Because, for instance, Ekta, I also ended up with a chronic cough at some point. It lasted over a year, right?
Okay.
I couldn't figure out what it was for. Doctors gave me inhalers, medication. I went to all kinds of things. I went to various doctors, ENTs, pulmonologists, X-rays, XYZ. I tried Nathi's, this thing, post-nasal drip, all kinds of things, right? The cough wouldn't go.
Hmm.
Eventually, there was one ENT who looked at it and said, you know what? It's silent reflux. I can see your throat is now eroded. The first ENT I'd gone to, perhaps it was still new, so he wasn't able to see it. But this ENT saw it, said, your throat is eroded, right? Because
Yeah.
there's a digestive enzyme called pepsin, and that pepsin is coming right up to your throat and it's
Hmm.
eroding your throat. For that, you need to give up all foods that are slightly acidic and foods that you already, I think, like silent reflux is caused where one of the valves, your esophageal valve, is loose, that further loosen the valve. That meant giving up all forms of caffeine. I can't even eat green tea or matcha, right?
Hmm.
Cough begins. Giving up citrus foods, which was again difficult. But what I realized was what we eat is extraordinarily important, and we may not even be aware of how what we are eating is affecting our body.
Yeah.
It catches up with us much later. And that's the whole idea behind Tangelo. That when you eat out, when I eat out, I'm not a person who can easily eat out.
Hmm.
I can't eat most things when I eat out. And now I'm afraid of triggers. What else is going to trigger?
Sure.
Right? So that's where it came from.
Now, let me ask you, when people buy Tangelo, What do you hope they're actually buying beyond the product itself?
I hope they're buying trust. First and foremost, there's trust that we're transparent about what we put in, right? We don't hide anything, right? If we have to put something in, it's written right there. There's complete clarity, because I believe that if you hide even one ingredient, who knows, it may affect someone, right? That's what I've
Yes.
learned. And sometimes you do have long ingredient lists, because yes, you have to put many things in a product. There's very few products you can make with just one, two, three things, right? Especially a product that has to have shelf life and stay for a long period of time. You can't make it with one, two, three things. But whatever you're putting in, that we put good ingredients. They're all clean. They're all vetted by us. They are clean, and they're completely transparent. That there's not one thing that's been hidden in there.
Now, obviously, you had a personal story, which is how Tangelo came into the picture, and then your emphasis on ingredient transparency, as we just learned, and also the very emphasis on real food and everything has been vetted before it gets into the product. But let me ask you this, we tend to associate and get very specific about the product or the company. But if Tangelo disappeared tomorrow, what idea would you still want it to stand for?
If Tangelo wasn't here, what I'd want people to remember is the spirit behind Tangelo, right? Which is really how I've lived my life, which is about facing challenges, climbing mountains, whatever kind of mountain you're faced with, breaking problems down, big overwhelming goals into smaller pieces, right? Solving them one by one, of being of forging ahead even when you're afraid. I don't like saying unafraid,
Yeah.
because fear, we all have fears, right? But moving ahead even when there is fear and there's uncertainty, and following your passions. Something, Tangelo is, it was born from passion, right? It was born
Yeah.
from my health challenges. It was born from passion. And I think it's that spirit that I want to live on. And also the spirit of reinvention, because Tangelo is my I've reinvented myself many times, but this is the reinvention I'm really most proud of,
Love.
right? And this is a reinvention that I'm most passionate about. So it's about reinvention, right? It's so different from anything that I'd ever done before, and I'd like that spirit to stay alive.
Um, Aisha, I have to say, what fascinates me throughout the conversation has been this, that whether we're talking about health, education, travel, entrepreneurship, or identity, the same philosophy keeps appearing, which is focus on what you can control and let go of what you can't. You once shared a quote saying that you're only responsible for half of what happens to you. Question number one, what does that mean to you? And second, how has that idea shaped your own life?
You know, what that quote simply means is, you can't control 100% of what's happening around you and what happened to you. You can't control it. You can't control it at work. You can't control it in a relationship. You can't control it in your life. Come on, even when we are born, we can't control uh, our parents. We can't control the genes we are given. We can only control the what we make of what we have been given, right? So
Yes.
that's what it means. You can only control 50%. And once you accept that, then you stop getting frustrated with fact things you cannot control, with other people's circumstance. You just have to accept it. People will be who they will be. Things will happen. Circumstances will change. It may not all be fair. Life is not fair, right? But you can focus on what you can control. You can control your reactions. You can control what you do next. You can control how you feel about something. So that's what it means to me, and that's a philosophy I've learned to live by.
Love that. You often speak about breaking overwhelming goals into smaller pieces. Where did that mindset come from?
No, Ekta, I can't. I
You're
can't.
probing.
I don't think I can identify exactly where it came from, but perhaps it all came from just from math, right? Maybe that's where it came from. That to get through it, I had to break it up into small pieces. It's also rock climbing. Rock climbing teaches
Yeah,
you,
yeah.
when you're climbing a rock, you don't know how you're going to get up there, right? If you're climbing in a gym, you can see the holes. But when you're climbing an actual rock, and when I grew up, there were no rock climbing gyms. Now there are gyms. So we climbed on actual rock, right? You went out and you went bouldering, you went climbing. You don't know how you're going to get up there. I can't see any of the holes. I have no idea. So you're looking at this wall in front of you and you have no idea how you're going to get. You can just see a few things, and you just say, okay, I'm going to take the first step and start. You take the first step, you put one foot on there, then you look around and you find a place where you can put your hand. You can grip with your fingers. Then you look around a third. And then you
Yeah.
keep moving step by step by step. I think that's the most important thing I learned from rock climbing.
Now, so let me ask you this, Vedar. Why do you think people become paralyzed with big goals, and how can they start moving again?
You become paralyzed because you're looking at the whole thing. You're looking at the goal. And that is, it's very overwhelming, right? It is. If you look at a rock face and you look at that and I've got to get up that, how are you going to get up it? You can't, that's impossible, right? And then you start telling yourself it's too hard. You take a step back. It's what I always, that's why I think rock climbing is such a great activity. You have no choice when you're climbing a rock but to take that first step, look for the first step, and then the second, and then the third. And I think you've also got to play a few mental games with yourself,
Hmm.
right?
Hmm.
When you look at a goal and it's too large, you get overwhelmed. We all do, right? For
Hmm.
instance, I swim every day. And when I swim, I love swimming. But when I'm swimming, if I'll say, okay, I'm going to do 60 lengths, right? It's overwhelming. Even the number 40 is overwhelming. And I've got to count to 40. I've got to count to 60, right? It gets exhausting, up and down, up and down. Suddenly I'm at 28. And I, good God, this is never ending. It's now we're going, right? So I started playing this little game with myself, right? It sounds ridiculous, but it works.
Hmm.
Where I break it up into sets of four,
Hmm.
right? So if I'm in a 25-meter pool, I'll break it up into sets of four. And after four lengths, I count one, right?
Yeah.
So
Just make
now,
it easy for you. Don't make it
yes,
so big that
big.
it
So
becomes
now
hard.
I don't walk into the pool saying I have to do 40 lengths or 60 lengths. I have to
Yeah.
just do 10 sets or 15 sets. And I've arrived at the pool saying I have to do 10 sets or 15. And 10 or 15 is a smaller number to count to. It's,
Doesn't put too much
you
pressure.
know, I remember telling my swimming coach about this, and she just thought I was crazy. She said, but you're swimming the same distance. It doesn't, I don't understand how that's different. I said, it's a mental game.
Yeah.
You got to take the big goal and break it down into something smaller because the big goal is sometimes just too overwhelming or it sounds unattainable. So,
Yeah, but
whatever you need to do, play a little game with yourself, make it sound attainable.
yeah. I think we should play this podcast in front of her so she'll get the whole background in the story. All right, as we come towards the end of this conversation, I keep returning to one theme, which is not success, not resilience, but freedom. Because perhaps every chapter of your life has been leading towards that. Do you think you're the same person you were 20 years ago? What paths remain unchanged?
you know, uh, Coming back to how we began the conversation about whether you know who you're going to become as you get older, and I said that you come full circle. If you
Yeah.
had asked me this question 10 years ago, I'd have said, no, I'm not the same person I was, that many years ago when I was a teenager, when I was a child. Now, if you're asking me that question today, and the answer is yes, an overwhelming yes, because I finally come full circle and found that girl again. Some
Oh,
of it consciously, some of it subconsciously, because that person is always there inside you. And I am that person. And the parts of that person, of that girl, the teenager that are still there today,
yeah.
are the curiosity, the adventure, the never say die attitude, the way I face challenges. And I think this pure joy for life, right? When I was a teenager, there were so many things in life that I wanted to do and I wanted to experience, and I did many of them, right? I actually did many. I wanted to climb mountains, I did them. I wanted to learn to scuba dive, I did them. I wanted to travel there, I did it. I got there. I wanted to go to college in the US, I got a scholarship and I made it, right?
Yeah.
I did it. And then as you get older, I think it happens to all of us, right? Life
Yeah.
becomes more restricted, more regimented, and you start, other goals take a back seat and you compromise and say, well, I'll focus on this and this.
Yeah.
And now, so many years later, I think that zest for life has returned where I've suddenly realized, you know what? I could do it then and I could do it now.
Yeah.
Everything doesn't happen instantaneously, also. You just have to keep it there step by step and one by one. I'm now doing all the things I've wanted to do.
Love that answer. And this is such a positive answer because I think a lot of people are not able to bring back or get to the old self, the fulfilled self from where they started. But let me also ask you in the whole process of coming to the full circle, were there paths that had to be rebuilt again intentionally?
Yes, Ekta, I think that happens to all of us,
Yeah.
right? there's a lot of rebuilding. I didn't go back to being that girl again. I had to intentionally say, I want to. I'm going to seek it, right? I could feel it. I'd say surging up within me, and I'd say, yes, this is how I'm going to live. I'm going to choose to live the way I did then. You have to make that choice. And once you've made the choice, Ekta, what I've realized in life is you have to make a choice. When you make a choice that you're going to change something in your life about yourself, the way you live, your work, whatever, once you've made that decision, right, you'll be able to do it. You have to take the decision. It reminds me of something my mother once said about me in passing, right, a couple years ago. She said, Aisha, one of the things I've realized is when you don't like something or you feel something is not working, after a certain point, you do something about it and you change it. And what I've seen about you is that sometimes you don't know exactly what the answer is or what the next step is, but what you do know is that the status quo is not working and the
Yeah.
status quo needs to change. And you just take a step to change it. And when you take that first step to make the change, you may not immediately reach the destination you need to get to or find what you're searching for, but you've stepped out of the status quo. Made us change.
I love that part. Aisha, there's a quote you shared that says, there comes a time in every woman's life when she stops caring about what anyone thinks, and that is actually when she's free. Tell us the story behind it.
Ekta, first, I wouldn't say the quote is only about women. The original quote from the book happens to say woman, but I think it applies to every person, right? And that's the way I look at it, right? But the specific quote is from this book by Elizabeth Gilbert called City of Girls, right? And she writes about a young girl called Vivian who was expelled from Vassar and then ends up in New York City working with her aunt who owns a theater company. And she works as a costume designer. And Vivian is flamboyant and known to be wild. But eventually she grows up, right? And she builds a career in theater until she's forced to, there's a scandal, and she's forced to flee the city because the public scandal is so huge. Right. And then she comes back to New York many years later and she builds a very successful career as a wedding dress designer. And she's put everything behind her. And she's actually not as wild as she's perceived to be, right? She's perceived to be wild when she's actually a highly intelligent, empathetic, sensible young woman just learning how to live life on her own terms, right? She's not all the things that people think she is being. And she's carrying so much shame about everything that happened and everything that people said about her. And eventually she forms this friendship. And this is why the quote struck me, right? Because her story was so striking. That's why the quote stayed with me, because she said this. And then her story struck me about how she got to live with her own terms, how she began to live life on her own terms. She became friends with a police officer who had PTSD and he was a World War II veteran. And he wasn't able to talk about many of these things with his own family. So she used to sometimes meet him in the park, right? And I don't know how she met him. I don't remember the details now, but it was just a purely platonic friendship. Two people would meet in the park and sit on a bench and walk and talk, right? And they connected over the fact that he was hiding his PTSD from his colleagues, from his family, because he was so embarrassed by the fact that a male police officer could suffer so much trauma and still couldn't handle it emotionally. And she was still dealing with the fact with everything that happened in her youth, right? And she still hadn't come to terms with it so many years later, even though she'd put it behind her. And his daughter thought it was an affair, and she writes a letter. The whole novel, I think, is a letter to his daughter and when she says, and his daughter asks her, so who were you, right?
Yeah.
And she says, that's it. We just met in the park and chatted. That's all. There was not an affair. There was no relationship. It was just purely a platonic friendship based on that. And that's why it struck me, because Vivian was such a rich character. But to me, what the quote actually meant was that eventually, you stop letting go of what people think of you. You let go. I think we all carry a little bit of embarrassment about our lives, right? We all do. It's
Yeah.
normal, right? About things we've done. I wish things had worked out this way. I wish that had happened. Or I think you just learn to let go of all that. You also let go of what people expect of you, because at that point I was in my 30s when I read this, and the 30s for most of us is a time when life changes drastically, right? You have responsibility, you have expectations. There are so many people who you are responsible for. People expect things from you, and sometimes you lose sight of who you are, and you lose sight of you sometimes stop being yourself. You stop taking care of yourself as well, right? And you stop putting yourself first, right?
Hmm.
That happens to many of us. And I think, to me, what this quote meant was that at some point you've got to let go of what's expected of you, what people think of you, what someone may think of, whether a decision you make is selfish or not. You've got to learn to put yourself first. When you
Hmm.
put yourself first, right, that doesn't mean you're being selfish. You're just doing what is right for you. And that ties back to another quote that, oh, it's not really a quote. It's something a girl told me when I went to college in the US. I was 17 then, and I just arrived in college, and we were chatting. And she said, you know, when you come to college, you have so much freedom. And we were the same age, but right, someone, I don't know whether she thought of it on her own or someone had told her, but I'm so glad she said it to me, right? And she said, you have so much freedom. You're not answerable to anyone but yourself. And that is the hardest thing, right? So it's a time of huge responsibility. And I think that's so true, because being answerable to yourself is the most difficult thing, right? You can pretend when you do something that doesn't sit right with you, when you
Yeah.
do something that doesn't feel right, you can say, yes, it's okay, that's fine. It doesn't matter. You can justify it. But, when you sleep at night, you've got to live with yourself. You,
Yeah.
you can't lie to yourself.
God.
Your conscience knows you cannot lie. You know the truth, right? So I realized that if I if I can live with my decisions, if I am at peace with my decisions and my choices, then the choices I make are right. And
Yeah.
it doesn't matter what anyone thinks, it doesn't matter what's expected of me. And that's why I think the two quotes together to me make a lot of sense, right? Just one, and not one in isolation, but the two of them together is sort of how I live my life today.
Love that answer. All right. If you could sit across from three versions of yourself right now, the young girl struggling with dyscalculia, the teenager losing her hair, and the woman standing at the beginning of Tangelo, what would you tell each of them? And what do you hope the woman you'll be 10 years from now thanks you for?
You know what? I would still come back to that same quote. I think I said it earlier. It gets better. It only gets better. That's what I say, right? I've looked at each aspect of my life, and every time I've gone through a challenge and I've reached a new place, done something different, you know what? I've realized it, all difficult times pass and it gets better. And each year, my life has become richer and better, right?
Yeah.
I've enjoyed every year of my life, however different it is. It's led me down to different experiences. It led me down new paths, different experiences. I've become stronger. I'd always say, don't worry, it gets better. And 10 years later, what would I thank myself for 10 years later? I thank
Yeah.
myself for reclaiming the person I used to be, right? I
Ooh,
think that's so important, that I reclaim that person and found that girl again. And I think that lies within all of us, right?
hmm.
If some part of us is dormant, it's lying there, claim it again.
Yeah. Now, Aisha, every guest who comes on this show gets asked one final question. This show is called Unapologetic Me. You've spoken today about identity, resilience, self worth, health, entrepreneurship, reinvention, confidence, and freedom. You've shared stories of moments when life challenged you, labeled you, tested you, and asked you to become someone new. So, today, after everything you've lived through and everything you've built, what does being unapologetically yourself mean to you?
You know what it means, Ekta? It comes down to those two quotes, right? That I mentioned. The one in the book that says there comes a time in everyone's life where you don't have to worry, you stop caring about what other people think, and that sets you free to be who you really are. And the second quote that this girl in college told me, you're not answerable to anyone but yourself. And that's the hardest thing, right?
Yeah,
It's a combination of those two things. I think live, if you can live your life or at least for me, if I can live my life with these two principles, right? That I have the strength to be free enough to be the person I want to be. And I know my choices are right and I can live with my choices and I can sleep well at night and my conscience is clear, then I'm okay.
Love that. All right, one final question. Who is Aisha Malhotra when nobody's expectations get a vote?
When nobody's expectations get a vote,
Yes.
in that case, you know what? I love sport. I love sport and I love reading. Those are the two things I'll go back to. I love books and I love sport. I'll be swimming, I'll be doing some sport, and I'll be reading. These are the two things. When there's nothing else expected of me, these are the two things I love.
Asha, thank you for giving your time and being so insightful and genuinely trusting with all the details. It means more than you would know. And this is not scripted, I'm sharing it from the heart. And I'm actually going to say it takes a lot of guts to peel back the layers. I think even while I was covering, there were moments when I was feeling it. I was like, I'm not sure if I should have asked because this is like too much. You're going back the history and reliving the moment that you were at that point in time, whether it was about the school time, the hair, or the health. And so I'm very, very grateful. I feel very honored that I get to learn so many things about you.
Thank you so much, Ekta. I'd really like to thank you for pushing me to do this podcast. You know, when you first asked me, I was nervous, and I was nervous because I think it's difficult for all of us to talk about our personal lives, right? And especially talk about them publicly,
Yeah.
right? And I'm so glad that you pushed me because, you know, when you eventually sit down and you peel back the layers, you realize you've come a long way, and you realize it's all these challenges are make you who you are today,
Yeah.
right? So sometimes it is important to go back rather than, you know, sometimes you have a tendency to shut out the difficult times, right?
Yeah.
Once you've moved on, you close that door and you never look back at it again. You're done with it, right? And so at some point, when there's enough distance and you're able to, many years later, peel back the layers, as you said, right? It's very helpful to do that because then we are able to realize everything that you learned from it and why those times were also important, right? If life were easy, if life
Yeah.
was simple and everything worked out the way you wanted to, I think we wouldn't be as strong as we are, right? You
100%.
need the challenges. You need the challenges in life. You need that too.
For an impressive story, we won those milestones. And it's I think one thing that's really stood out is that in everything you figure out a way to bloom.
I
It's
think
not easy.
I think Ekta, we all do that, right? Because you have to keep going. You don't have a choice, right?
Yes.
If you don't keep going, you're static,
Yeah.
right? You have to keep moving forward. You know, you can't. I don't think you can let one obstacle just hold you back, right? If something things are going to go wrong, right? Stuff is going to happen. It's life,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
You just have to keep going. Maybe you won't take the same path. You might take a different path.
Yeah.
Paths may change, destinations may change, but you've got to keep moving forward and they lead you to new paths, new destinations, new experiences.
Today's conversation wasn't about ice cream. It wasn't about consulting. It wasn't about degrees, businesses, awards, or achievements. It was about something much more fundamental. The relationship we built with ourselves, because life will change, rules will change, our circumstances will change, our health may change. The way people see us may change. But if we know who we are, if we trust ourselves, if we continue taking the next step even when we cannot see the summit, then we become something far more valuable than successful. We become unshakable. And perhaps that is the mountain worth climbing. Thank you for joining us on Unapologetic Me. Until next time, keep choosing yourself, keep trusting your journey, and keep showing up as the person only you can be. This is me, your host, Ekta Kurana, signing off. Live your life unapologetically.